What's up, everybody? I've kind of got brain fry after a couple days of going through Fomenko's new chronology. He makes a lot of good points, he brings up a lot of interesting facts, but it is a trudge to get through to a clear understanding of anything. He'll go off on a topic and then get into a subtopic of that, and then a related topic of that, and it might be 30 pages later till you get back to the original thought. So I know what I'd like to make a video about here, but I can't promise that that's the way it's going to go. This might go just completely rando shat, but we're going to start off with the idea of ancient cities changing names with new rulers. Think about the city of Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great after he conquered half the known world. Alexandria is in Egypt. Alexander is a Macedonian, which is Greek. Alexander was obviously a king before he started his conquest. That's how he gained an army. So by default, he had to have had a capital city in Macedonia in his homeland. So was that original capital known as Alexandria, the city of Alexander? It kind of makes sense, but we're used to our modern way of thinking that the name of a city is just a geographic marker. But the ancients might not have thought of everything this way. I can't think of Alexander's father's name, and evidently I'm never going to have internet back on here, but it was something simple, like we'll just say Philip. I do remember he was a great man in his own right, but got overshadowed by Alexander. But let's say his father, Philip, was king of the Macedonians. So they called the capital city Philippia, the city of Philip. So when he abdicated to Alexander, did they still call the city Philippia? Or did they call the city Alexandria? You see what I'm saying? So I'm just using that as an example. If your custom is to call the capital city as the king's city, well then when you change kings, you change names of the city. And then if the king goes off and conquers half the known world and decides to make a new capital city in a far off land, then does the old city keep the same name? In our example, we have the city of Alexandria in Macedonia, the city of Alexander, and then Alexander sets up a new city in Egypt, so that becomes Alexandria, the city of Alexander. Well, then the original city in Macedonia might change names to something like Alexandrius, meaning the birthplace of Alexander. And this is just a complete hypothetical. I'm making all this up. But I think you can follow the logic there and see why ancient cities might have changed names. Ancient names had meaning, and we live in a world where the meaning of words has changed. And actually, the more I'm thinking about this, the more it's making sense. I mean, look at Istanbul. It used to be Constantinople. Why did it change names? Because the Muslims took it from the Christians. I can even illustrate this here in my post-apocalyptic no-internet world. Hispania, modern-day Spain, used to be Castile. Gallia or Gaul, modern-day France. Anatolia is Turkey. Persia is the various Middle Eastern countries, Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and this whole area right here. Well, all of Africa was known as Libya in Plato's time. And then Tataria on this map, which I'd place around the 1600s, is just the Soviet Union in this book, published in the 80s. Now we call it Siberia. But the names of all kinds of countries have changed over time, so why wouldn't cities be like that too? On this map, this whole area just used to be the Ottoman Empire. So when a new consulate decided to take control of this area, they call it Syria. We think in terms of whole countries today, but back in the day, they would break things down in more localized regional powers. Did Alexandria completely not exist before Alexander? Or did Alexander take over that area of Egypt, find a really nice city, and say, hey, I'm going to make this my capital, and then just build a royal palace in an already established city? Same thing with Istanbul. The Muslims didn't build a city there from scratch. It was already Constantinople. And allegedly, Constantine had moved Rome from Rome, Italy, allegedly, we'll get into that later, to a city named Byzantium that he then called Constantinople. So these are just the famous cities where the obvious answer is that it changes names. Now, that doesn't make that the rule. It doesn't necessarily apply to everywhere. I think Athens was always Athens. But I am questioning whether Rome, Italy was the capital of the ancient Roman Empire, and if the modern day Holy Land was actually where biblical events took place. Now, this isn't a new concept that the names of cities have changed. But this is the first time I've thought about it in the terms of new management, new name. As in, a conquering royal family moves into a city and then they change the name. By the way, this image I've been showing is a 1400s drawing of King Nimrod and the city of Babylon. The ancient city of Babylon from whatever 2000 BC looks a lot like a medieval Gothic city. And the famed Tower of Babel looks like any other medieval tower. And the name says Tower of Babylon, not Babel. I'm not sure how that got shortened. And this is where it's really great to have internet to look things up, but I think the name Babylon means Gate of the Gods, which makes some sense. The Old Testament refers to the Elohim, or El, as a god. So Bab-El-On, or Bab-Elion, which we'll actually get to here in a little bit. In Machu Picchu, you have a Gate of the Gods. But let me give you Flamenco's overall theory of things. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's given me food for thought. He says that all the written history we have all happened within the last 1,000 years, and that there was a great world war in the 13th century, which is right there around the Black D and the catastrophes I keep talking about, which, yeah, drought and flooding and massive crop failures are going to cause outbreaks of wars. He thinks that Jesus was crucified around 1165 AD, about 900 years ago, and that some of the events in the, quote, Old Testament are more recent than that. So that line of thinking made me wonder if the following is possible. I've talked a lot about how the powerful ones used to be here. Again, the Elohim, the Greek gods, pick a name, but every culture has a story about these superhuman beings. And they apparently used to live among us. You didn't have to believe in them. There they were right over there. They all left and went somewhere. I don't know. But it seems like after the majority of them were gone, then Yahweh shows up. And once again, this is just thinking what if, but what if that all happened like 1,000 years ago? And mankind has only been left to fend for ourselves for 1,000 years. I'm not going to try to make a case for that, but it's definitely popped up in the back of my mind going through Flamenco's work. But they say Nimrod, a giant, was 2000 BC, and then David and Goliath way back in the Bronze Age era. While in America, Magellan met giants down in Patagonia. I've got a book of the first Europeans to go to Peru, and the natives there remembered the giants. North America, same deal. So the giants of the Mediterranean world disappeared 2,000 years ago, and they were still here 300-400 years ago in North America, South America. Anyway, here we have a depiction of Nimrod in a very modern, shiny, new-looking Gothic city with stained glass windows, and there's even a Muslim crescent on the spire back there. Now, back to the idea of cities changing names. Guess what city this is? Well, if you guessed Jerusalem, you'd be correct, but I don't know how you guessed that. But yeah, this is supposed to be the sack of Jerusalem, 79 AD. And apparently this is Vespasian and the Roman Legion. Doesn't that look like the Roman Legionnaires? And there's a couple of really famous items missing from the booty here. I've talked about this a couple times before, but where's the famous golden menorah and the silver showbread table? Those are very big deals in Yahwehdian culture. Nowadays, they will seriously try to tell you that the theft of the golden menorah was how they financed the Colosseum in Rome. So I'd kind of expect to see that front and center here in the plunder, but nope. This drawing is from the 1400s, allegedly hundreds of years after the Crusades, and the Knights Templar made it safe for all the pilgrims to go visit the Holy Land. But everything about this is portrayed as medieval European. And then one building there that looks like medieval Muslim with the minarets. Now, cities changing names. This was originally the city of David, right? If I could, I'd look up how it came to be called Jerusalem for you guys, but you can look it up if you're really curious. But it either changed its name or Jerusalem was a different place altogether. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, but another example of how city names used to be different. Different people and different languages would have different names for the same city. This is a French map showing London, England in 1754, and the French called it Londres, which Fomenko speculates as land of the Rez, the Russians. And he has a lot more research to back up that claim because he shows where a dynastic Russian family fled to England. If you've studied history at all, you know that usually the royal family, whoever's ruling a land, isn't even from there. I mean, wasn't it William the Conqueror that came up from France and took over England? But prior to that, he makes a good point of why do the British Isles have 5 native languages? Well, it could very well be that 4 of them weren't from there. Anyway, different people could have had different names for the same cities, especially if the name of the city meant something, like, say, the White City. This is another complete hypothetical, but the English would call it Whitington, and the Spanish would call it Blancoton, or Blancovilla, the Spanish word for white being Blanco. At least I'm pretty sure it is. I usually double check these things when I have internet. Yeah, it's not driving me crazy at all. But let's jump into some of Fomenko's work here. Some of this might not make any sense to you if it's pertinent to the story and I actually know what he's saying. I'll explain, but we're going to jump right into the middle here where he says they have a handwritten Slavonic church compilation which contains the Passions of Christ. And pretty much all of this is different than our official history of things. And just know when he mentions Scaligerian anything, he just means the official textbook narrative of any particular event. So these Slavonic passions claim that after the crucifixion of Christ, the city of Jerusalem was taken by the Roman troops on the orders of Tiberius, son of Augustus, lord and ruler of the whole world. The Scaligerian official narrative says that this was Vespasian and Titus that did this. The conquest was led by great Prince Licinius, who I've never heard of personally, who is also called Tsar and Supreme Ruler of the Orient. This conquest of Jerusalem is described as a great war whose itinerary and ideology liken it to a crusade. Bear in mind that the Passions also use the term Judean Rome for referring to Jerusalem. By the way, the letter J was invented in like the 1400s. It's a new concept. And it's best that I don't say certain names on here too many times. This is in good correspondence with our hypothesis that Jerusalem from the Gospels is the very same city as New Rome on the Bosporus, or Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The First Crusade, Alexandria in the 11th century as the Old Rome in Egypt, Jerusalem equals Troy equals Ilion as Tsargrad or the New Rome. Just to clarify a little bit, he breaks down world history into 3 ruling empires, the Babylonian Empire, then the Roman Empire, then the New Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantines. But he is also saying that the ancient city of Troy that we have in our heads as 2000 BC or whatever is Constantinople, is Jerusalem. All the same city right there on the Bosporus and the Black Sea. He also claims that the Trojan War was the same thing as the Crusades, just repackaged. And also that these Crusades that on official timelines are spread out over hundreds of years actually all took place in relatively the same time. We know little of the First Crusade of the alleged year 1096, which also identifies as the Fourth Crusade of the 13th century as per our reconstruction. Nowadays, as a rule, the renditions we find in textbooks are all based on the Western European sources, which only describe the itinerary of the Western Crusader troops. Only a number of special works report that the campaign was started in the East and that the Western European Crusaders arrived a while later when the combatants had already engaged in battle. The general belief is that the Crusaders came to assist the Byzantine emperor who was fighting a holy war against the, quote, infidels. Having heeded the proclamation of the Pope, Scaligeriites are of the opinion that the residence of the Pope had been in Italian Rome. However, the new chronology claims that no such city had yet existed in Italy back then. Let us ask a simple question. who were the, quote, infidels fought by the participants of the First Crusade, which equals the Fourth Crusade. Just so you know, one of the Crusades was against Constantinople. Another crusade was against Jerusalem. So if Jerusalem is Constantinople, then they were all the same event. That's why he's saying the First Crusade equals the Fourth Crusade. Scaligian historians believe the infidels in question to be Muslim. However, Islam had not yet existed as a separate religion in the 12th century, according to our reconstruction. Just so you know, there's all kinds of old drawings showing the Christian cross and the Muslim crescent moon, both flying above the same building. According to the accounts of the Crusade, the infidels can be identified as the Judeans, who were the very party that the Crusades had opposed. That makes you look at things a little different. This is in perfect correspondence with the fact that the First Crusade began immediately after the crucifixion in 1185 AD as its direct consequence. Now, I've said this for a long time. It makes no sense that after 1,000 years, then they decide to go take over the Holy Land. It makes a lot more sense that they went directly after to avenge Christ for the crucifixion to the people who actually did it. It didn't take 1,000 years for this news to spread across Europe, especially when the official narrative says that after the Judean uprising, they sent for Titus, who was stationed up in Britain, and he showed up in a matter of months with an entire Roman legion. There's a lot of logistics involved in moving an entire army, but big news could spread from the far eastern stretches of Europe all the way to the British Isles in a matter of weeks. Moreover, this concurs with the opinion of the Crusaders themselves. It turns out that they believed they were waging war on the Judeans, or the actual tormentors of Christ. So apparently surviving accounts of the Crusaders themselves say that they were going after the actual people involved. Nowadays, this belief shared by the Crusaders of the First Crusade is believed to be a manifestation of their, quote, medieval ignorance. However, this was created primarily for the end of concealing blatant contradictions between the Scaligian version and the old historical tradition. A footnote is that one must not identify them of the 12th century as modern Yahwehdians, referring to the Khazars there. And I'm going to throw in just some random notes about that whole thing. This picture here is portraying the Trojan War on top, all of them in medieval garb, and then the founding of Paris, France on the bottom, as in back-to-back events. Everybody's heard the title Caesar, as in Julius Caesar. Well, nobody really has a clue if that's how it was even pronounced. Most people say it was closer to Khazar. In the original Latin, it was just CSR, no vowels. There's an old video on here that everybody should see by Harry Hubbard about the history of coinage and how much it's been counterfeited and then used to validate Scaligian history. And he used to work as a purchaser for rich people to go out and buy things such as coins. And he said that one of these dealers presented what was supposed to be an authentic coin of Julius Caesar, and it literally said Julius Caesar on there, all spelled out. Well, the J was invented in like the 1400s, so his name was more like a Julius. And then, of course, a coin of his time would just say CSR, but this coin had all of the vowels in there. So then he started testing these dealers and saying, well, what about Emperor so-and-so that was only emperor for like a week, which has literally happened. And they'd say, well, I don't have one right now, but I'll see what I can find. And then his next trip through, sure enough, they'd have a coin of Emperor so-and-so for a week, who obviously would have never had any coins minted in his short reign. But this idea of the Caesar or the Kaiser, the ruler of the old world power, trickles down to basically every country out there. I mean, look at Tsar Nicholas of just before World War I. The ruler being the Tsar, the Kaiser. And then the KM on the screen there is a throwback to the same old world power. When the Muslims took Constantinople in allegedly 1453, they considered themselves to be the continuation of the old Roman Empire. But it would appear that some of the old rulers fled into Russia, and who knows where all else. Prior to World War One, the people of Eastern Europe still considered themselves Romans. Romania is the land of the Romans. And it really makes me think about the ruling royal families and the international courts. Okay, if you break international law, who do you answer to? Everybody? I mean, you might be at war with that country. So, I don't know, I kind of got all over the place there, but I'll just end off with this. It's interesting to think that the Crusades might not have been against the Muslims and been who he said that they were fighting against, which goes a long ways towards explaining the war that's still being waged today. If you saw my video about the gray aliens that are kind of superior to us mortal humans, where our proper role is just to serve them. Especially if you think about the Crusades being a fight against them as an Eastern European power, and how they've had a strong historical presence in this country that used to be known as this. And as the old story goes, it was a country of cutthroats and bandits. And it was an ancient Russian king that said, well, you guys got to find some kind of god or we're going to come down and wipe you guys out. Just factor in Fomenko's footnote here. So they're kind of the ancient mortal enemies of the Rus. And then 100 years ago, they spearheaded the Red Revolution and introduced communicationism without the cation in there. Anyway, I better just stop right there. Yeah, I find it very possible that the ancient names of cities may not be where we think of them today. And I think we've established a protocol that when new governments take over new countries, then sometimes they change the name, so the same was true for ancient cities. Probably not all of them, but Byzantium turned into Constantinople, turns into Istanbul, depending on who was running the show. And I think it's very possible that that same city could be the biblical Jerusalem. It's something I'm definitely going to look into more when I have some internet. There's certain geographical features that have to line up, and that do line up with the modern day city of Jerusalem, but you might be able to do that with everywhere. I mean, there's the Siloam Spring. It's just a underground water system. There could very well be the same kind of setup in Constantinople. The Mount of Olives, that could be any hill outside of the city. A lot of these features aren't incredibly unique. They could happen in basically all the ancient cities. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.